to week 3 of the AE911Truth broadcast. This webinar is about 9/11 Blueprint for Truth, the architecture of destruction. Week 3, we'll be focusing on the Twin Towers, and I'm delighted to be joined by our Director of Operations, Andy Steele. How are you, Andy?
Great, Richard. Thanks for letting me be here to help you out with this important project.
Can you let everybody know what you think is important about this webinar and outreach of ours?
Sure. It's very important to get the evidence that you're going to be looking at today into the minds and sights of everybody that you can. So there's going to be a lot of important stuff that Richard is going to be going over regarding the destruction of the Twin Towers, things that people may not know. And I recommend everybody who's coming here for the first time to pay attention and submit your questions to us through the question box. And also, you can change the resolution on your screen right in the options beneath the YouTube box. Change it to a high definition so you can see the pictures a lot better in the presentation.
Yeah, for some reason they don't. It doesn't come in high res for automatically on the YouTube. So you have to go to the gear box and select 720 HD, and you'll be able to see the small text. Be much better for you. Well, architects and engineers for 9/11Truth came about 10 years ago when I learned about this fascinating, critically important information that actually thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, even on the day of 9/11 and afterward, became aware of this evidence that was not shown on mainstream media, not provided by our government following 9/11. And it took me 4 years fumbling around, swallowing the official story hook, line, and sinker. That is to say, I believed what I was told, that 19 fundamentalist hijackers brought these towers down with jet planes and jet fuel. And we're going to be showing you evidence today that should challenge most of you. It is extremely important, and we now have 2,400 architects and engineers demanding a new investigation of the destruction of these towers, and by our government. And why? Because we do live theoretically in a democracy. And we need to go through the channels that we have been given, and we need massive public awareness on the subject, and particularly the architects and engineers, who most of whom are unaware of the evidence we're going to be showing you today, and of the evidence for the third tower that collapsed on 9/11 that we focused on in week 1 and 2 of this seminar. I have myself been an architect for 28, 29 years now, and I've worked on numerous types of construction, including these $3 and $10 million gymnasiums in the San Francisco Bay Area, and the $125 million construction administration for this high school in the Bay Area. More recently, though, I have worked on this $400 million project in Las Vegas, Nevada, with 6 blocks of retail and 2 mid-rise office buildings and parking structure, altogether about 1,200 tons of fireproof steel frame construction. And like many other architects who have worked on this type of building, it prepares you for a kind of a solid understanding for some of the concepts we'll be exploring. And the 2,400 architects and engineers that I've worked with have been exploring this as well. And you know, we've given presentations in 38 foreign countries now, about 550 times, to groups of 100 to 3,000 in Chicago. We have been quite successful in shifting the belief systems, if you will, by showing this scientific information to almost everybody in each of these audiences ends up agreeing with us. Many of them sign our petition, as these gentlemen and ladies have now supporting the architects and engineers from all over the world and demanding a new investigation. And today we're focusing on the evidence for that investigation as respected as we look at the Twin Towers. We'll look at the sudden near freefall collapse of this building, these high velocity lateral ejections, the complete shattering of the structural steel system down to the ground, and the mid-air pulverization of concrete, and much more. And as we look at these towers, it's quite important for us to note that there was quite a bit of controversy when they went up. Some praised the architect for the sculptural purity of the forms from the building. Others, like Robert Stern, a famous architect, says this is gigantic dumbness. Well, it's quite interesting. What do? You extrude two squares until they become the tallest buildings in the world at the time, surpassing the Empire State Building, which was quite beautiful in its unfolding of its masses and this Art Deco style architecture. But no matter how you feel about the design of these buildings, they did have a structural innovation, which was extraordinary, because prior to this, you had a forest of columns in these buildings, making the interior office planning extremely difficult to plan around. What we did in the Twin Towers, designed in the late 60s, built in the early 70s, is surround the elevator core with this thick the lateral resisting system composed of 14-inch steel tube columns with 3 verticals, 3 horizontals welded together, and then in turn bolted to each other, creating an exoskeleton surrounding these heavy columns of 22 inches by 52 inches down at the bottom. But then between the perimeter structure and the core structure, you had 60 feet of open office planning available by the use of these lightweight steel trusses. And it's really quite an amazing floor plan and innovation in structural engineering, allowing this openness, which was quite new and revolutionary. And most of our skyscrapers employ this kind of open office planning these days. So an extraordinary structure, which by most accounts was only half occupied at the time of 9/11, which is an interesting fact to note as we contemplate the implications of what happened on 9/11 and begin to look more deeply into some of the corroborative and speculative data surrounding the destruction of these buildings. But look at the open office planning. This is unheard of in high-rise structures until this time. So we need to appreciate that, and we'll begin to look at some key features of the destruction of this building as we focus on them relative to this open structure. The interior 47 massive core columns represent about 50,000 tons of heat sink in the core. In other words, any fire that got hot enough to affect the steel's strength would be rapidly conducted throughout the system. And this is one of the very important reasons that high-rises have never collapsed due to fire before or since 9/11. And another important reason, as we'll look and see, is that these high-rises are fireproofed. The steel is coated with generally a cementitious fireproof coating. We'll come back to that. Let's focus on recollect what happened that morning, how the official story was developed.
On September 11th, we learned that 4 passenger planes were hijacked and taken radically off course. Within an hour, 2 of the planes had flown into the enormous steel towers of the World Trade Center, creating fires and eventually toppling them. Dazed by the news, the American public soon believed the fires in the towers had burned so hot they caused the steel frames of the buildings to give way. A myth developed, fed by official sources through the media to a bewildered audience. Elements of the myth. The impact of the airplanes, gallons of burning jet fuel, steel melting, the buildings failing and suddenly imploding. In a mere 10 seconds, 110 stories hurtled earthward, pulverizing into dust. Right from the start, on the street itself, the official story was born.
Come out of nowhere and just scream right into the side of the Twin Tower, exploding through the other side. And then I witnessed both towers collapse, one first and then the second, mostly due to structural failure because the fire was just too intense.
The myth bled into the FEMA report and was echoed by the experts.
It was the combination of the impact load doing great damage to the building, followed by the fire, that caused collapse.
Well, here's pretty much the official story in a nutshell, readily digestible by the media and government. And what we're going to do now is test that official story. And we use the scientific method. We've had it in the West for over 100 years. We have a question. How did the towers come down? That's what Congress was tasked. That's what NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, was tasked with by Congress, determine the answer to that question. And we perform research. How have other towers come down? We make some observations. We construct a hypothesis or a series of hypotheses. Our best guess as to how the towers came down. Educated guesses. How have other towers come down? For instance, fire. We think that's our best guess. Or maybe explosives. That's a decent guess. Let's lay out all the possible hypotheses and then test them by making predictions and working with experiments to find out what makes the most sense. We analyze results, we draw conclusions. If the hypothesis is corroborated, we report the results in an open, transparent manner. And we'll find out how NIST did relative to that. But noting very briefly that we have certainly a lack of transparency we'll be looking at on the part of NIST, which did not report their input data for their computer, which they used to prove, unquote, how these towers came down. They cited that, well, we can't release this input data. It might jeopardize public safety. Well, how could it jeopardize public safety to release this input data to the architects and engineers who are tasked with ensuring the public safety when they design these high-rises? So we have a real problem with the answer to our FOIA request, Freedom of Information Act, and their refusal to divulge. So the scientific method uses open, transparent data so that others can build on the body of the work that is being done. That's how science builds on itself. You know, we know how gravity works because the experiments were not hidden in a black box, for instance. Now, if the hypothesis is not corroborated, we go back and find a hypothesis that stands a better chance against the data and work through the cycle again until we're sure of our conclusion. With that in mind, let's apply the scientific method and see what's retroactively here. What was done? Well, in 2001, right away, we had volunteers who came together. They're called volunteers. These are volunteers that have shown up in other disaster response analyses at people and firms who are heavily dependent on federal contracts, which morphed into the FEMA, from the American Society of Civil Engineers. They now have $600,000 of funding, and we'll look at the reports that were done there. And we have a Silverstein-Weidlinger report, which is not as public, not made public for us. It was done to support Silverstein's claim for additional funds that he was seeking from the insurance companies. 2005, we finally have the final NIST report on the Twin Towers. They had $20 million of funding. It took 3 years, and we'll be looking at their conclusions. What's interesting to note here is that through each of these series of reports, we have some of the main characters who started right off from the bat with the original volunteers into the FEMA report and on into the NIST report, and even those who guided the popular mechanics response to those who were questioning the official story. So these are not independent reports by any measure. So that's important for us to note. What is the basic official story of, in more detail? What's claimed is raging fires in the Twin Towers. And in the case of the South Tower, we note that those fires were basically out before the explosions began, which initiated the collapse. But NIST says there's raging fires which caused a sagging of these floor trusses because the jet planes had knocked the fireproofing off of the steel structure, which they prove by taking a shotgun and blasting fireproofing off of steel. And it didn't even work then. But nevertheless, they claim that that proves that this happened. You can learn more about that from the work that Kevin Ryan has done and peer-reviewed on journal-of-9/11research.com. Anyway, if the floors were sagging due to fire, what's claimed is that these columns were pulled in then and they buckled, allowing this, in the case of the North Tower, this 15-story structure to then drive down the rest of the building after these columns buckled, and then it destroys itself. We'll look at that mechanism. What's interesting to note here, though, is that sagging floor trusses provide very little lateral loading on these perimeter columns. And so what does NIST do? They, in their computer model, which we did learn, they impose an artificial 5,000-pound load all around these columns to force them to bend and buckle in their computer models, thus enabling, and simultaneously, by the way, all at once, showing that in their computer models then that how the building comes down in a manner that we see in the videos, which we'll take a look at in a second. So this is only one of dozens and dozens and dozens of ethical problems associated with the NIST report, which we'll be looking at some of coming up right here as we examine, is there any features of typical controlled demolition in the Twin Towers, such as a sudden onset of destruction at the location of the jet plane impacts, not at the base of the structure. Remember, this is a deception, as this is the case we're making, that in this deception, we're being asked to conflate the destruction of this building with the jet plane impacts. Therefore, where would the destruction start if it was to be set intentionally? It would start at the point of jet plane impacts, where those huge explosions of jet fuel occurred, which even NIST says most of which, 90% of which, burned up outside the building. In 10 minutes, the rest of it was gone. We're talking about normal office fires after this point, heating this building up, because the buildings came down about an hour or so after the jet planes. There's quite a bit of time in there for these fires to have burnt and then burnt out, in the case of the North Tower almost, South Tower almost. So in this deception, we'd be looking for witnesses that heard sounds of explosions, that saw flashes of light. This is very typical features in a controlled demolition. So let's take a look and see if that's true. And it's fascinating to note that the City Fire Commissioner, Thomas von Essen, interviewed 500 of his own FDNY personnel and to preserve the account before it became reshaped by a collective memory. So even as early as October through January, we have these recordings, which were hidden by the city until the New York Court State of Appeals forced the city to release them to the New York Times. And not until August of 2005 did we have an account of these 500 made public. And here it is, because the New York Times actually published it. What did we learn? Well, 118 of these firefighters observed flashes and sounds of explosions. And guess what? None of them appear in the final report by NIST. Let's look at a couple of them. We felt the ground shake. You could see the towers sway. And then it just came down. So you'll hear this order of events again and again. The ground is shaking. The explosions are heard, and then the tower comes down. You get the order of that. It's extremely important. It's not that the tower is collapsing and therefore that's why we're hearing this. I.e., the cause of the tower's collapse is heard in the explosions that these gentlemen are hearing, and ladies. All of a sudden, the ground just started shaking. Felt like a train was running under my feet. The next thing we know, the tower is collapsing, says this firefighter. Shook my bones, says this paramedic. Shortly before the first tower came down, I remember feeling the ground shaking. I heard a terrible noise, and then debris just started flying everywhere. One explosion one floor under another, an explosion in the South Tower. Figured it was a bomb because it looked like a synchronized, deliberate kind of thing. Seemed like on television when they blow up these buildings, seemed like it was going all the way around like a belt. All these explosions, says this firefighter. These are credible professional witnesses, and yet their testimony is not included in the generation of data for the background research used in the scientific method, typically. Let's see what they're talking about. On the right, you see here the North Tower. On the left, a known explosive controlled demolition. Is there any similarity? We're looking at a sudden, nearly symmetrical onset of destruction, very, very fast. Turns out to be near freefall. Turns out to be 60% of freefall. Is there enough of a similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives, especially since it looks exactly like a controlled demolition, especially since no fire has ever brought down a skyscraper, ever. We have hundreds of examples, at least 100, of very hot, large, and long-lasting fires in these buildings. Yet NIST went straight for the hypothesis of fire and sought to justify that with their computer models and their selection of witnesses, obviously ignoring the witnesses of explosions. In fact, Congress actually tasked NIST with explaining to the American public how these buildings came down due to fire. They actually prescribed in the language of the charter that fire was the cause of the building. So NIST was actually kind of hamstrung by the original charter. Somewhere around the middle of this World Trade Center, there was this orange and red flash coming out. Initially, it was just one flash. Then the flash kept popping all the way around the building, and the building had started to explode. Let's take a look at the South Tower. On the right, a known controlled demolition on the left. Is there any similarity? Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives? We think so, and yet NIST did not even look for evidence of explosive residue after claiming a year before that they found no evidence for explosives. When pressed, they agree in writing that they never looked. I thought the terrorists planted explosives somewhere in the building. That's how loud it was, a crackling explosive. Well, let's listen to these credible witnesses, which represent hundreds of witnesses, but we don't have time to show you all of them. Take a look at these.
As we were getting our gear on and making our way to the stairway, there was a heavy-duty explosion.
The whole building just collapsed on us inside the lobby. Was that a secondary explosion? Yes, it was.
That was the...
Yeah, definitely a secondary explosion.
I heard a second explosion and another rumble.
An hour later than that, we had that big explosion from much, much lower.
It just went boom, it was like a bomb went off. And another explosion came right from it, just everyone flying.
There were numerous secondary explosions taking place in that building. There were continuous explosions.
No, the first explosion, and there was a second explosion in the same building. There were two explosions.
Okay. Federal agencies that were down there do believe that there was some sort of explosive device somewhere else besides the planes hitting. There was another explosion that took place in one of the towers here. So obviously, according to his theory, he thinks that there were actually devices that were planted in the building.
There was a secondary explosion, probably a device either planted before or on the aircraft that did not explode until an hour later.
Then there was secondary explosions and then the subsequent collapses.
That the FBI most likely thinks that there was a car or truck packed with explosives underneath the buildings, which also exploded at the same time and brought both of them down.
Now, that's the first time we're hearing that. So 2 planes and explosives that were in the building. Is that correct?
That is the working theory at this point. That is...
It sounded like gunfire, you know, bang, 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 and then all of a sudden 3 big explosions.
About 50 consecutive bangs, and it fell down like a waterfall.
And we heard the noise associated with an implosion. We heard a very loud blast, an explosion. We looked up, and the building literally began to collapse before us.
We heard a loud explosion, and at that point, building 2 was collapsing.
At that point, we heard a large boom. I looked up and just saw the building coming at us.
Do you know if it was an explosion or if it was a building collapse? To me, it sounded like an explosion.
There was another major explosion. The building itself, literally the top of it came down.
All of a sudden you hear explosion and you could see the building starting to collapse.
Huge explosion that we all heard and felt. We understand now there has been a secondary explosion on Tower 2.
According to the Associated Press, another building that has either been attacked or exploded.
The tower, rather, that has collapsed, that we are told collapsed because of a third explosion.
And about an hour later after that, there was a huge explosion at the base of the South Tower. That's One World Trade Center, and part of the building collapsed.
We could hear a rumble, which was about 5 seconds long, preceding the actual collapse, and then a boom when each of those towers collapsed.
Just seconds ago, there was a huge explosion, and it appears right now the Second World Trade Tower has just collapsed.
I was about 5 blocks away when I heard explosions.
And then you heard from far away, boom, boom. And you heard the boom, 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 boom.
Floor by floor instead of popping out.
It was if they had detonated.
Yeah, detonated.
Planned to take down a building. Boom, 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 boom.
From the corner, boom, 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 boom. Just like 20 straight hits. And as the bombs were going, people just started running. And I sat there and watched a few of them explode, and it just started going pop. It just started going boom, 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 boom. And he goes, how fast? I go, like firecrackers.
Well, how many of these reporters do you imagine ended up in the final report by NIST? Not one. They claim they interviewed thousands of people and took the kernel of the best evidence and testimony, but none of these made it for some reason. Well, they then claim, well, it couldn't be a controlled demolition because it didn't start at the bottom. Well, there's plenty of controlled demolitions that don't start at the bottom. Here's Mark Loiseau of Controlled Demolition, Inc. that describes the process and this particular controlled demolition Where does it start?
You can go almost anywhere in the structure, and given the right circumstances, you can release all of that stored energy, converting it into what is called kinetic energy. That's energy in motion, and that's what brings the building down.
From the top. Well, NIST says, well, the upper part of this building, after the damage from the heat from the fire weakened the steel, drove the rest of the building down to the ground and then destroyed itself. We're going to take a look at the physics of this with Newton's third law of motion, where we have an equal and opposite reaction. When a lighter body collides with a heavier body, what happens? We all know. In this case, the Volkswagen cannot possibly do a lot of damage to this Mack truck. What happens if we drop the Volkswagen on the Mack truck? Does that help the situation? No. Same situation. You might dent the bumper, the front grille of the Mack truck, but you're not going to do much damage to it. Just not going to happen. The lighter part of a structure, any structure, in this case the Twin Towers, cannot possibly damage the hard, cold, intact steel, which gets heavier and heavier, stronger and stronger with each successive floor, because the steel framing and engineering in the structure below has to hold up all of that weight. In concept, it's a pyramid, actually, of structure and steel density. The lightest part is at top, where the steel members are only 1/4 or 1/8 inch thick. Let's take a look then and see actually what happens in the North Tower in the first 4 seconds. After several explosions, we see it itself is being destroyed, just like the Volkswagen. In the first 4 seconds, there's nothing left, actually, to destroy the rest of the structure. Let's take a little bit of an analysis look here. In the first 2 seconds, you see a telescoping, very similar to Building 7, in fact. It's a miniature controlled demolition, if you will. This first phase of this tower's destruction reduces the top portion, 15 stories, to basically a liquid. It's not a mass anymore that can destroy the section below. Let's take another close look as we start and stop. Oops. Start and stop, where we have bands of explosions, just like the firefighters described, wrapping all around the building symmetrically as the top falls down in on those first 15 stories. In fact, do any of the photos or videos show an upper 15-story section, in the case of the North Tower, driving the rest of it down? No, it's gone. After that, what you see is the building tearing itself apart. And it looks very similar, in fact, like the volcanic eruption in the Tongan Sea in 2009 on the right, World Trade Center 1 on the left. Much more similar to this massive explosion in the case of the Twin Towers, more like massive explosions, thousands of them. What does it look like to you intuitively? Ask yourself, is this an apple or is this an orange? We're told it was an orange, but it's obviously an apple. Look down below where you see a massive series of isolated explosive ejections, a very violent series of explosions, particularly down the right corner here, traveling almost as fast as the freely falling structural steel elements. The North Tower and the South Tower are coming down at near free fall acceleration. This has been clocked by David Chandler as about 2/3 of free fall acceleration. It's accelerating straight down through what was the path of greatest resistance, the 100,000 tons of structural steel that's 5 times stronger than it ever needed to be to support this building. Where did it all go? To allow 90% of its strength to disappear. Where did that go? What does it look like to you? Is this a collapse or an explosion? Let's take a look at the South Tower. It begins after these series of explosions, which you can see now, to tip. In fact, it's falling at 22 degrees off center. So we have asymmetrical loading from this piece, this 30-story section in the case of the South Tower, falling off of the mass. We have asymmetrical damage from the columns done by the jet planes. We have asymmetrical damage from the fires, because fire only burns through a given area in the building, every 20 minutes or so. That's all the fuel there is. So it continues looking for fresh new fuel sources. So buildings that fall due to fires fall asymmetrically. And yet, what we see from below is complete symmetrical destruction, floor by floor, from top to bottom, completely shattering the structure. What are we looking at? Take a close-up look now from below. Are we looking at a pancaking collapse, or are we looking at a series of hundreds of explosions? Individual explosions all working together to create a roar, which is what most of the witnesses described, a massive roar, in addition to those other witnesses you heard, which heard individual pop, 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 all the way down, completely shattering the structure down to these shards remaining at the base. And look at the deeply oxidized and reddened ends of these beams, where the individual elements of these columns, are flayed out. Some of them convex on one side, concave on the other, indicating perhaps a side concussive blast, as suggested by Gordon Ross from Scotland in his. We have a straight down symmetrical progression outside the footprint. Number 2 in our series of features of controlled demolition. Well, it's a 207-foot wide building, and the material is all around it symmetrically in a 12 to 1,400 foot radius or diameter, destroying the winter gardens on the left there, 600 feet away from the North Tower. And look at building 7 on the right. We have complete symmetrical destruction in an implosion, a classic implosion. This highlights the difference between World Trade Center 7, which we looked at in week 1 and week 2 of this webinar series. Compare that to the massive, complete catastrophic destruction and lateral distribution of all of its structural elements outside the building footprints. Do we have evidence of explosives or squibs, isolated explosive ejections? Well, take a look where we have here, here, and here, 60 stories down, as much as in 20, 40 stories down, in this case, 60 stories down, isolated explosive ejections. Are they going off, explosives going off at the wrong time, perhaps, mistimed? Clearly, they're explosives. And take a look, as you see here. These are pulverized building materials, not puffs of air, as NIST suggests, being produced by that non-existent pile driver, which destroyed itself in the first 4 seconds, as you see here. There's nothing left to push air through a massive system. Plus, if this was, in fact, air being pushed down the elevator hoistway, it would reach that open office planning that's typical on each of these floors and blow out all these windows, or none of them, but not these highly focalized, pinpoint accurate, violent ejections occurring in a geometry like fireworks, or in this case in the South Tower, where on the left side of this beginning to collapse building, simultaneously through multiple floors, hundreds of isolated ejections, at least dozens in this case, all at once, explosives appearing to be compromising the structure, allowing it to fall suddenly at near free fall acceleration. Well, these explosions are clocked by
the South Tower begins to explode,
physicists.
You track 2 squibs near the bottom of the frame. They shoot out quickly at first, then slow and merge in with the rest of the dust cloud. Using the first few data points, we see the first squib shoots out at 44.98 meters per second, or about 100 miles per hour. Doing the same for the second squib, we get a speed of 56.3 meters per second, which works out closer to 126 miles per hour.
Those are speeds associated with explosives, not air pressure produced by some piston somewhere. So, and again, you can see the pulverized building solids in these isolated explosive ejections. And what's happening to the structure itself? Is it totally dismembered, which is the object of a controlled demolition? So you can pack it, load it, ship it away. A lot of isolated explosives completely shattering the structure down to the ground, as we've seen, and distributing the structural steel elements outside the boundaries of the perimeter of each of the towers, such that, you know, we don't have even a pile of floors down at the bottom. These structural steel elements are broken up into shippable lengths. And we have the lateral ejection of steel. This is one of the elements of explosives that the National Fire Protection Association refers investigative agencies to look at, the shattering of the structure and the ejection of its structural components. As you see here, freely flying structural steel sections. Here's section 1. This is not like a banana peeling of the exterior perimeter structural steel system. And particularly here, where we have a 45-degree angle of this element shot out of the building. 1, 2, 3, forward, back 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, back 2, 3. This is clearly an ejection of a 4-ton structural steel section, at least. And it's been shot out horizontally, and then, of course, gravity begins to take over. Well, how does gravity work? Gravity works down. What is the outward component or vector of this ejection? What's causing that can only be explosives, for which we have abundant evidence that you've seen so far and coming up. The heavier elements from the mechanical floors are shot even farther, indicating much more intense high-energy explosives probably involved in this case, enough to send a 200-pound cannonball 3 miles for each of these 4-ton sections. That's a lot of energy, because there's a lot of distribution of thousands of structural steel elements. Where does that energy come from? And what's left at the bottom of each of these towers? Well, we should have 110 steel floors that, concrete floors that should be stacked up, you know, in a pancaking collapse. Tom Patrizio was one of the contractors who delivered those floor panels, and he's back helping with the cleanup. He says, not one floor panel. Where did they all go? There were 6,000 of them. Well, on the right, you see what should have been, what would be more typical of a pancaking collapse in Mexico in this case. On the left, you see maybe a 3- or 4-story pile of core columns, perimeter columns, aluminum cladding, and other debris. No stacked up floors. 110 are missing. They're the size of a football field, each of them. Well, they're occurring, what's happening to them appears to be in these massive pyroclastic-like clouds of pulverized concrete, because the concrete is not down at the bottom. It's not breaking up after it develops its force through gravity. No, we're talking about the massive breakup, pulverization in mid-air. What is pulverizing 90,000 tons of concrete in mid-air and distributed throughout lower Manhattan in a blanket, in 100-micron particles, in an average of 4-inch blanket of powdered concrete, 3 square miles. That's where the concrete is. And 20 to 30% of this dust, as analyzed by the U.S. Geological Survey, is powdered concrete.
And you see, and there's no concrete. There's very little concrete. All you see is was aluminum and steel. What happened to the concrete? The concrete was pulverized, and I was down here Tuesday, and it was like you're on a foreign planet. All of lower Manhattan, not just this site, from river to river, there was dust powder 2-3 inches thick. The concrete was just pulverized.
Governor Pataki is very helpful.
What I expected to see was nothing like what I actually did see at the time of my arrival at the site. There wasn't much that you could say, you could describe. Everything was dust and metal. There was no typewriters, there was no chairs, there was no nothing.
Well, there were probably 10,000 file cabinets in each of these buildings, but guess what? Steel file cabinets, they couldn't be found. Here's the one that they did find. And it was in the basement, which is the reason, probably the only reason this much of it survived. Something was responsible for the massive pulverization, which claimed many victims as well.
In April 2006, New Yorkers were distressed to learn that bone fragments, human remains from 9/11, had been found on the roof of the nearby Deutsche Bank building.
And how in God's name did those fragments get there?
And bone fragments less than a centimeter long. How could they be so small?
Wait a minute, 700 bone fragments found on top of the Deutsche Bank building across the street from the South Tower. How could they be so small, and how did they get there? Great question. Well, they didn't come from the people in the plane, which hit the tower and sent its ejections out this way. It didn't come from the people in the plane in the North Tower, because the South Tower is directly between the North Tower and the Deutsche Bank building. We had 2,750 victims, but only 300 whole bodies were found. What about the rest? We had 20,000 pieces of bodies altogether, 6,000 of them small enough to fit into a test tube. And yet, 200 pieces matched to one single person. And still, more than 1,151 victims completely unaccounted for. Not even a piece small found the size to fit into a test tube. These people are evaporated, vaporized. What causes that? They should have been found between layers of floor stacked at the bottom of a gravitational collapse. And yet, if you look at the distribution of the victims, most of them well beyond outside the perimeter, along with all the dust. 600, 800, some of them 1,000 feet, these body parts outside of the building which they were in when it collapsed. Can gravitational collapse cause such massive pulverization of people and elements? Is the hypothesis corroborated for you of the explosive demolition of these buildings? Have we shown so far in this first part of our two-part World Trade Center Towers webinar the elements, at least half the elements in this first part, of direct evidence of explosive destruction? Can fire create any one of these features, let alone all 10 of them? Do we have additional supporting corroborative evidence that we'll be showing next week as well? Whistleblowers, experts' corroboration, foreknowledge of the destruction. Is this proof of controlled demolition so far to you? Proof beyond a reasonable doubt? If so, I encourage you to take some action and start by signing our petition. It's online. Just takes a couple of minutes. Calling for a new investigation of the destruction of these towers. Become a member of AE911Truth. Join us in supporting us to get the word out like we're doing now, like the other efforts we make all across the country, where we go to structural engineering and architecture conferences, like what's coming up in Philadelphia, where we intend to have an evidence booth yet again, probably the 7th or 8th time we've done this now, where we reach thousands of architects and engineers who see Building 7 particularly coming down, who are asked, you know, how did this building come down? What does it look like to you? They all say controlled demolition because it's just so obvious. And we get them to sign our petition and support our resolution, calling upon the AIA to call for a position statement. Have a position statement that says we need a new investigation. You can also donate to AE911Truth right on the website, if that's where you are, or you can find your way there to AE911Truth.org. You can also volunteer with AE911Truth, and I like Andy, our operations coordinator and volunteer supporter coordinator, to help us with some ideas as to how you can do that. Andy?
Thanks, Richard. If you're moved by this evidence and you agree that there should be a new investigation into the destruction of the Twin Towers, you can certainly help out AE911Truth with our important mission by getting involved as a volunteer. If you got specific skills, you can lend us, or if you want to help out with one of our ongoing outreach projects, all you got to do is just go to the What You Can Do tab at the top of AE911Truth.org. You can click the volunteer tab that comes up after that, and there's a form you fill out, and you just fill out that form and we will get in touch with you and get you to work helping us out. And many of our projects are very simple, but we reach a lot of people, so we definitely encourage you to help out if you are moved by this evidence. So back to you, Richard.
Thanks, Andy. And there's other things you can do from your own computer. You can contact your elected reps and your representatives in Congress, your television, radio, newspaper stations. You can write, get the word out, send our evidence, tell everybody you know. Send the AE911Truth.org link to everybody on your mailing list and say, hey, here's 2,400 architects and engineers who are calling for a new investigation, and here's a link to their free DVD or video called the 9/11 Explosive Evidence Experts Speak Out, and other videos which we have on our website. You can screen these DVDs and videos to audiences in your own living room and larger audiences at libraries in your communities. You can share the AE911Truth brochures, banners, and other material we have one-on-one by tabling in your community, which means just put up a table or hand out literature on the streets. We have millions of people doing that around the world, particularly on the 11th of every month in their local communities. One of the most popular, more recent landmark publications that we have is our magazine, Beyond Misinformation. It includes dozens of myths that we bust that have been put out by NIST, and we show the evidence that you've seen today and much, much more about Building 7 and the extreme heat that we're going to be going into next week. That's found by witnesses and so forth, officials even, at the World Trade Center skyscraper site. The e-version is available. You can actually download this booklet, 50-page booklet, right now. There's a link below on our website, below where you're watching, or if you're not watching on our website, you can go to the website AE911Truth.org link, click on free email newsletter. That's our news flashes, which you can sign up for free, even without signing the petition. But we would want you to also, of course, sign the petition. There are 2,400 who did, and there are dozens of high-rise architects, structural engineers, metallurgists, chemists, physicists, controlled demolition experts, all laying out the evidence in this landmark effort of ours that's now 4 years old, that remains the top effort in the 9/11 Truth movement, we believe, to bring the explosive evidence to the attention of government officials, academic professionals, media representatives, and people of all interests. Let's take a look at this 3-minute video. It will floor you.
to be involved in conspiracy theories. I know that there are lots of them that can go on. We can speculate on that forever. What we really need to know is how those buildings came down.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
To undermine scientific integrity is to undermine our democracy.
This is what NIST has done, denied and ignored crucial evidence.
The American people absolutely need the truth of 9/11.
More than 1,500 architects and engineers and 12,000 others, including many scientists, have signed the petition calling for a scientific investigation of the destruction of the Twin Towers and World Trade Center Building 7. The report, issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, referred to as NIST, was not valid science.
They're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building.
Building number 7 descended in free fall for the first 100 feet, which means that there was absolutely no resistance to descent whatsoever.
So all of the columns really needed to be severed at the same time.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
NIST has admitted it went into free fall for 8 stories.
You don't need to be an engineer or an architect to see what happened to those buildings.
Dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten. Zeker weten.
What I saw, it was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it.
NIST excluded the documents from FEMA in Appendix C that documented the evidence of melting steel.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel.
There were these iron microspheres present in all of the dust samples. They needed to have been formed in extremely high temperatures.
All the characteristics of the microspheres, along with what I see in the attack of the beams that were actually found, tell me that thermite was involved.
In the dust, what we have found is a modern version of thermite, which we call nanothermite.
NIST concedes that they found no evidence for explosives. So then we asked them, well, did you look? And they said, no, we did not look for explosives or residues of explosives.
And in fact, the evidence is overwhelming that these red-grade crystals are very high-temperature incendiaries.
And we have watched as scientific integrity has been undermined and scientific research politicized in an effort to advance predetermined ideological agendas.
If this is a crime, I think everybody agrees it's a crime. Evidence was removed from the scene of the crime. You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. And the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science.
Do organize a screening in your local community of that film. It is as good as you see there. And of course, much more, 90-minute film. By the way, the 60-minute version of Experts Speak Out, as we call it, is available on YouTube. Just Google Experts Speak Out. You'll see it there. Our latest film includes Eric Lawyer and myself busting 24 myths from NIST. Firefighters, architects, and engineers expose 9/11 myths. And we're in the middle of a national tour, the Northwest portion of which begins this Friday in Seattle. And then we go to Portland and into Spokane, Washington, and then 3 stops in Idaho and 6 stops in Montana. If you know people there, be sure to alert them to the website where we have a banner down below that takes you to the tour schedule. After this, we'll be looking at the Southeast and then the Midwest, and then we go through Canada the first 2 weeks of August. So a lot of exciting things coming up for AE911 Truth. And what we explored this week is the explosive demolition of the Twin Towers in this webinar. Starting on Thursday, we'll be looking at the massive extreme heat that jet fuel cannot possibly be responsible for, or office fires. That is found in the evidence of the Twin Towers, including pyroclastic-like clouds, iron microspheres, molten steel and iron, thermite, nanothermite, all of which we'll explain to you next week. But first, we want to give you an opportunity to ask your questions and see if we can give you some helpful answers. Andy, I'm sure that we have some questions so far from our listening viewers.
Oh, we certainly do, Richard. First one I got here is, what is the source for the information that the World Trade Center was only half occupied? Obviously, this would facilitate the installation of demo charges.
Well, it certainly would open it, make it easier for those operatives whom we don't have their identities, of course, and we don't speculate about those identities. But it would have given a lot more access to the towers. And there are numerous researchers who have suggested that the towers were only half occupied. I do need that backup myself, since you're asking the question. I'll put it out generally. Does anybody have a specific documentable proof of that? Because it's been heard again and again and again, and not really contested. So we have taken it on face value. But let's find out if we can get some actual documentation. Also, in terms of access to these towers, it's been asked, well, how would you get through? Well, we know, for instance, that there's been a 9-month elevator modernization going on the 9 months prior to 9/11. The largest elevator modernization in history. Ace Elevator had the contract. And we would like an investigation of Ace Elevator because it would have given them access to the core columns and beams in this building, which is immediately adjacent to all of these 50 or so elevator cabs in this building, each of the buildings. So they fled, actually. This is a scandal documented in USA Today in October 2001, and they said that 85 employees of Ace Elevator fled when the first plane hit. These are experts in the rescue of victims through the delivery systems of those victims, which are the elevator shafts, elevator cabs. Firefighters rescue these victims. So this is an important source of future investigative work.
Okay, the next question, I'm going to combine a couple of them because there's a couple that are asking about this, but it's making reference to the 5,000-pound lateral load on the perimeter columns. Was this in PSI or what? And how many PSI does it take to pulverize concrete?
It takes a lot of PSI to pulverize concrete. First of all, excuse me, I don't have that answer at hand. I'll look that up and provide an answer to you, because we should have each of your emails. The 5,000 pound is a point load on each of the columns. So if you impose a pressure of 5,000 pounds laterally on these columns, that's what NIST did. So it's not an impulse load. It's simply an increased pressure to the weight of 5,000 pounds laterally. Which then forced which forced each of those columns to buckle, enabling the load above this floor to come down. Go ahead, Andy.
Okay. Next question is, have you given any presentations at universities across this country about this?
We've given about 60 presentations at universities around the world altogether.
Okay. The next question is more political, but it's asked, I presume this is a non-issue for current political candidates?
In general. Well, we would like to have it be the topic. Shouldn't it be the topic that's discussed in all of these political discourses and debates that we're having? I mean, this is the event that started 2 major wars. We've invaded Afghanistan and Iraq. We've murdered, well, some call it that, some call it collateral damage, but anyway, 2 million people have been killed. And our civil liberties have been taken away in legislation and executive orders such as the Patriot Act, the Military Commissions Act, the National Defense Authorization Act of 2012, in which any of us can be arrested without being told what we're charged with, without a right to a lawyer, a trial, a jury. This is incredible loss of civil liberties, and we can even be tortured, even assassinated, for merely being associated with terrorism, and that's not even defined. So it's a bad state of affairs. We've got to have discourse in the political circles about this. The only thing we've had so far is Donald Trump calling for a release of the 28 redacted pages, which seems to implicate foreign governments. And he did say, interestingly enough, if you want to know how the Twin Towers came down, elect me president, and we'll find out how the Twin Towers came down. Well, we don't know what to make of that, because he also made statements damning the Muslims for bringing the Twin Towers down. So we don't place our faith in any candidate unless they're calling openly for a new investigation of the destruction of all 3 towers.
Right, and I will say that on national television, Representative McDermott, I'm not sure if he's still in office or not, but did say that the questions being asked about World Trade Center 7 are validated and they should get to the bottom of it. I'm paraphrasing, but he said the sooner the better in his opinion. So there is some support about the very questions that we are asking, maybe not necessarily the conclusions, but about getting to the bottom of this issue. Okay, the next question.
Of course, we have also taken our petition when we reached 1,000 and then 2,000 petition signers. We've given our petition and our DVD to each of the 535 political representatives in Congress, and we will do that again when we reach 3,000.
Now, can you, because somebody's asking about the experts that are arguing in favor of the pancake collapse. A lot of people think that that's the official story, is the pancake collapse. So can you elaborate on that and explain, again, guess why it's not a pancake collapse?
Well, it's a bit theme. The pancake collapse theory came out early on and suggested that these floors, when the first 1 or 2 gave way, that was too much of an impact on the subsequent floor below, and then collectively they caused a pancake all the way down, pancake and collapse all the way down, like you saw in that slide from Mexico. That did not explain the failure of the columns, however, which would have remained standing in such a pancake collapse. So NIST evolved toward the column failure theory, which says that the perimeter columns failed, being pulled inward by these sagging floor trusses, and then that allowed the 15-story section in the case of the North Tower, or 30-story in the case of the South Tower, to drive the rest of the building down. It's more of a pile driver theory based on initial column failure.
Okay, we just got this one in. It says, is there an estimate of how many tons of explosives would have been needed to cause the destruction?
We don't have an estimate of the explosive requirement. What we do have, and as you'll see next week starting Thursday, is an analysis of the quantity of residue of thermite and nanothermite, ignited thermite and nanothermite found in, and unignited nanothermite found in the piles, which suggests about 10 tons of material was available in each case. So we know there's at least 10 tons of material that appears to have been used, and we could also easily, I imagine, find out through the quantity of materials used in normal controlled demolitions how much high energy explosives were used. But remember, high energy explosives, which are normally used in controlled demolitions, provide very loud signatures, a bang and a bright flash. So in a deceptive controlled demolition like we have here, it appears predominantly that other materials were used, as we'll see next week. We didn't go over that material this week. But we do seem to have a fair quantity of high energy explosives as well. That's probably responsible for the pulverization of all the concrete. But we don't know what quantity that would take.
Okay. And our last question for the afternoon is, has AE911Truth ever considered building a physical model of the buildings to demonstrate why the official story is false?
We've certainly considered it. It's been offered as a suggestion several times, and one gentleman independently is going to actually try to build, he's a steel worker, he's going to build a scale model and actually apply lots and lots of kerosene and massive fires to it without even fireproofing it. But the problems associated with models are in the scaling of the structural elements themselves and the destructive elements. Fire doesn't act the same on a model than it does as it does on full-size structural elements. So it is fraught with problems, and such experiments would be fraught, and their conclusions would be fraught with criticisms, and most likely and most of those perhaps what's the word, justified. So yeah, so we're much more at home with the actual forensic evidence that we have for the explosive demolition of these 3 towers and presenting our case.
Okay, and that's going to be the last question for this Easter afternoon. I will say to that questioner, too, there is an article right now at AE911Truth, if you go under our articles and news section, on some experiments done by Jonathan Cole, where he didn't model the structure of the buildings, but he did some experiments using physical models to explore the motion, testing different theories on what happened to the Twin Towers that day, and observing the motion if you demonstrate those theories with the physical models. The article explains that, and you can see the video too embedded in that article.
Yeah, and where will they find that article, Andy? Because I want to make a point about that too.
Sure, it's under our news in our news section on AE911Truth.org.
This is exceptional, very recent, landmark experiment done by Jonathan Cole, the civil engineer, who's one of our petition signers. Now, in this case, it is very relevant because he's analyzing the result of a load on a structure and seeing through experiment if the entire building collapses, or if, as Tony Zambodi highlighted in his important work on this subject, where did it go? He wrote a paper called "Some Misunderstandings Related to the World Trade Center Collapse Analysis," and that is peer-reviewed in a publication, International Journal of Protective Structures, in which he, by calculation, shows that there would be a deceleration of any progressive collapse and a final arrest of such collapse after about 4 stories. We'll be including that in next month's series in week 3. Fascinating, and it's actually shown by experiment by John Cole as well. It shows the exact same results. So now we have results by calculation, and we have results by experiment. An experiment is what is used to create computer models in the first place. They all go back to the reality of the original experiments, and then those experiments are extrapolated and used to create various computer models. And that's the point that John so eloquently makes in his video that you can see on YouTube now.
All right. Well, I want to thank everybody for showing up and watching this presentation here this Sunday afternoon. We do these every Thursday at 1 o'clock Pacific time, 4 o'clock Eastern time, and on Sundays at 4 o'clock Pacific time, 7 o'clock Eastern time. So if you are moved by this evidence, you find it intriguing, find another person to watch it and talk about it afterwards and tell people about these webinars.
And next week, be sure to tune in Sunday at 4. As Andy mentioned, we'll be looking at the extreme heat associated with the Twin Towers, pyroclastic-like clouds, iron microspheres, molten steel and or iron, thermite, and nanothermite. Fascinating information we have for you coming up on Thursday and repeated on Sunday. Thanks, everybody. Join us again, and we'll see you out there educating professionals, government representatives, media representatives out on the 9/11 education circuit. Until then, bye-bye.